Hey guys, welcome back to the Thoughtful Therapist podcast. Today's a special episode. It's my very first interview ever. And we're going to get into who this is and why he's awesome and special and sitting next to me here in just a minute. So I just want to remind everyone, this is just a place for a free exchange of ideas. It's not a place for any sort of judgment. I just really like thinking about thinking. And so does my friend here, again, Hens Legacy. So today, the episode is going to be about the age where we feel like we know everything, but don't seem to understand anything. So it starts for me, this whole idea for this episode, when I was in grade school and I had this presentation on Gettysburg. And I remember going to Gettysburg, reading 20 books on Gettysburg and thinking the whole time, like, what's wrong with these people? But like, why are they standing in a line? Why are they using these weapons? Like, if I had a tank, I could win the war tomorrow. And the older you get, like, you think, like, yeah, but like the tank only had like 40 rounds. And what happens when you run out of gas? Like, it would be cool for 10, 15 minutes and now. But do you think you'd be the smartest guy around? I couldn't even explain how it worked. So the question becomes, like, are we actually getting smarter? Or do we just have easier access for previous information? And so today we have my good friend Joe on, Joe Gentili, and he is a librarian and an archivist and a self-proclaimed historian as well.
I have an undergraduate degree in history. My specialization was what we call the early modern period, so roughly 1500 to 1800.
It's a really smart guy. So my question is, like, I don't know, what do you think of that premise, right? Like, do you think that this is an age where we feel like we know everything but just have no clue?
That's an interesting question. I think your premise that we have more access to information than ever is obviously correct, but in some ways, having extra access to information means you don't need to know as much. Certain things that you know or that you're taught, you have to know, you have to learn to survive, to thrive. But once you have the ability to access things en masse like we do with the internet, you can rely on that knowledge when you need it instead of it sort of being a corpus that's always there, passed on from generation to generation.
Yeah, so what's the difference between that and knowledge? So, right, because like I can get the information.
So, I mean, your tank analogy at Gettysburg is a great bridging off point there. Like you said, what happens when you run out of gas?
We don't know how that thing works.
Exactly. Now we're in 1863 when like the process to refine oil and gasoline doesn't exist yet. And basically you have like a multi-ton steel box that's not going to do a whole lot of good once the can moves. Or if you run out of projectiles. Like, so, you know, using a technology or what have you is different than understanding how it works, how to perpetuate it, and how to teach somebody else to use it. And I think a big thing that when you talk about knowledge is that it has to be repeatable to somebody else if you wanted to teach them.
Oh, that's interesting.
And you can get into this in a variety of different ways, but part of why people write things down at all, part of why libraries exist at all, are so that I can take a corpus of knowledge I've learned and teach it to somebody I don't literally have to meet.
Sure.
And, you know, you could argue this is somewhat semantic, but knowledge to me is something that you can pass on in a digestible and understandable format to somebody else that can then learn that.
So then what are we doing when we're like, I don't know, Googling where my favorite band is from?
So in library world, we actually sort of differentiate these two things. If you ask me when the War of 1812 happened, I will tell you actually 1812 to 1814.
Sure. It's not just 18. That makes sense.
But if you ask a librarian, why did the War of 1812 happen? Instead of giving you an answer, I'm going to point you in direction of the resources that can answer it for you. I mentioned I have an undergraduate degree in history. I have a master's degree in library science also. And that is something you talked about pretty frequently in graduate school. This notion that there are sort of what you might call common knowledge questions versus critical thinking questions. Okay. The Declaration of Independence was signed and announced on July 4th, 1776. You don't expect somebody to go look for that answer themselves if you have my kind of role. But if someone said, why was the Declaration of Independence written and by whom? Now I'm not going to just answer that question for you. Instead, I'm going to say, well, in the section we have about American history or political philosophy or sociology, you can read X, Y, Z. And there are a lot of reasons you do that. But mostly, there's almost certainly someone that knows much more about this topic than you do. And you can point somebody in that direction instead of trying to answer it yourself.
That makes sense. But so, all right. So if the ability to access information is so simple, do you think that decreases our need to gain the formal knowledge?
That's
a tricky question for me, right? Like if it's just at your fingertips.
You're sort of getting into like, what's the value of information at that?
Yeah, something like that. Something. Yeah.
Does it have sort of less inherent value if it's easily accessible to everyone? And that's an interesting philosophical question. I mean, you could easily make probably an educated case in both directions. But a big thing about sort of the passing of knowledge is you have to trust the source.
Okay.
And that's something that I think like you have to factor in, especially in an internet age. If you learn directly from someone who's a master at something or well-read, well-versed in something, you know what you're getting. But if you find a Google page that answers a question for you, how do you know that was written or created by someone with the correct knowledge base? And that's actually part of what librarians do today now, especially in the digital era, is there are only almost too many sources for things. So how do I find reputable, good, proper sources instead of just an answer to a question? Because the internet opens the possibility that you can get lots of wrong answers to a question as well, even a common knowledge.
Well, yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's one of the biggest problems with AIs, right?
Yes. AI is aggregating from the information already available. So if what it's building these answers off of has flawed premises, flawed data collection, flawed answers, you're probably going to get something on the back end that's also flawed. And it doesn't mean that a human being would catch all of these flaws. That's not what I'm trying to say. But part of having so much information at your fingertips, when I say your fingertips, literally all of us with a smartphone, is how do you figure out what is good and what is useful? A simple question on Google might get literally millions of results, and you're not going to read through 3 million results to find the best one. But also, the top one or the most clicked on one might not be the appropriate answer to your question either.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, because one of the things that AI just it doesn't seem like it can do is it doesn't seem to understand the nuance of the question. And it seems to just completely forego that, as well as like wisdom on the topic. Like it projects and pretends that it does those things, but it doesn't.
I think some of what might be missing, and for disclosure's sake, I'm not a huge user of AI tools myself, though, is context. When you are dealing with an individual, a group, an entity, whatever, that is well-versed in a topic, there's lots of context that you don't get just because they answered a specific question. That comes from years of experience, years of engaging in a topic. AI inherently sort of can't do that. It's doing a surface treatment of the available resources in whatever period of time. And sometimes the answers will be great, but a lagging of sort of context and of experience is kind of built into the whole way those models are created and what you get at the end.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of the nuance I was talking about, maybe even the wisdom aspect of it, honestly. So, like, could you explain a situation where, like, you would be able to pull context out of a question to help someone in a way an AI couldn't?
Oh, so that's some of that. Like I said, is definitely going to come with experience. So could I? That's an interesting question. So for a sort of niche example, just because of the nature of what I do,
Sure.
I work at a biological research station that was created by an individual named Richard Archbold. My predecessor, who was also the librarian at Archbold Biological Station, knew Richard Archbold.
Sure.
But he, at this point, has been dead for almost 50 years.
Richard Archbold.
Yes.
Sorry,
Excuse me, not my predecessor.
Yes,
thank you. If I tried to extrapolate what his life was like based on the available documentary evidence, there's a whole story I can tell. But just because this person that knew him and interacted with him every day is around, it can change the whole complexity of the story. You can never get the full details out of the documentary record, period. And AI inherently is going to be built on whatever written word is available, or, photos, video, etc. But the point is, like, whatever is physically there on the source is what you're going to get. When you are dealing with an individual who's lived these experiences, who's possibly interacted with your subject matter, there's going to be all these little deeper level things that you just couldn't get otherwise. And a great example in this specific version that I can give you is Fred Lohr, my predecessor, working with Chartable for 4 years. So there are lots of questions, basic common knowledge questions that would be hard to answer, like, what did his voice sound like? What kind of clothes did he wear day in and day out?
Yeah, was he grumpy?
Was he grumpy?
Yeah, right. Was he friendly?
If you gave me everything he ever wrote, I could write you a book about him, and it would be super thorough, and it would be good. If you gave me everything he ever produced, it would be even better. But those little things probably would be lost in the shuffle, partly because we don't kind of record those things about ourselves, partly because certain things have to be observed by other people. So now if you ask me to describe this person's life, and it's not just because of Fred. Fred's the person I've interacted with the most. There are these whole layers of context I can add. I can tell you what he used to eat for dinner.
Yes,
because there are stories about that. He was fairly regimented in this. I can tell you about what kind of cars he drove, what he liked to do. Sort of simple. They sound like simple things. And I know I'm talking about an individual, but to your point about context and why it matters, I can tell a much more complete story about this person and his life because I knew someone that knew him and interacted with him. Sure. And even if he documented every day and every minute and recorded it all, there's no way you could do the same thing with strictly documentary, for lack of a better term.
Okay. That's interesting.
And so that kind of context is important, but also sort of to get a little more abstract, how we tell a story of what happened is part of what history is all about. In theory, you want the most perfect, truthful version of an event, a series of events, but in practice, that's impossible. We're not going to accurately record exactly how everything happens. But someone who lived through events and or has studied them in detail can provide much deeper context than somebody that sort of just gives you a surface treatment. I guess you can compare it to like a witness of a crime or something. If you were just there across the street and heard a car accident, you're going to have a very incomplete picture. Sure. But if you're sitting at a roadside cafe and someone crashes right in front of you, you're going to be able to tell the police much more about what happened.
Yeah. Okay. So it like kind of completes the story.
Yes.
One of the things I was thinking about before doing this interview was I remember when the internet first came out. That's how old we are. Like I remember going to the library and how things shifted in the experience. Right. So it went from finding the right books to get the answers to your questions to like teaching you how to ask the right question. Right. And so like, do you think that that's something that we could still help people with, like even with AI and Google, is just like how to formulate the question properly to elicit the most appropriate response?
Yes. I think that's one of the things that AI could actually be really good at as it's refined deeper and deeper. The more detailed a question you ask, the more appropriate the answer you're going to get. Yes. And if we can really fine tune that sort of system, then yeah, in theory, you can get more at the heart of like what you're trying to find. Ultimately, a library, in theory, is a place to find the information you need to answer one question, 10 questions, a series of questions.
Sure.
It's supposed to be a central place, but you have to be able to ask the correct questions to get at what you want. And part of why librarians exist at all is maybe you don't know the exact right question to ask, but you're part of the way there. And I'm going to help you get what you need, even though you don't exactly know what you need. Sure, that makes sense. And that really is a part of my job. Someone may come in and say, like, I'm working on a Gopher Tortoise project right now, but I have an incomplete sense of the literature in the state of Florida. And like, you could absolutely go trying to fill that gap yourself, or you could rely on somebody that knows where to find exactly what you're looking for. But you have to be able to frame the question a certain way. Like, oh, well, do you want Gopher Tortoises? Like I had my example just in Florida. They also live in Georgia and other places, etc. And having somebody that you can sort of have I had a professor that referenced it as a gatekeeper, but not in a negative way.
Yeah.
We tend to think of gatekeepers as keeping things out.
Yeah.
But he referenced librarians as a gatekeeper letting things in. You show up at the gate and you kind of know what you want. And the gatekeeper says, oh, that's 2 blocks on the left and 1 block on the right or whatever. So you don't have to wander aimlessly trying to find it on your own.
That's a funny nuance change in gatekeeping.
Yeah.
I'm sorry with you. Yeah.
And I think that, like, when you're searching for information at all, in a library or otherwise, that's ultimately part of what we want. Here's Google, because we all collectively have this expectation that something like what I just described has been happening and will continue to happening. There is some entity, be it digital or physical, that is curating these results because, Google's asked the same question potentially millions of times a day. So in theory, they should be able to streamline what an answer to that looks like and give you the best answer to your question. But if your question is not great, your answer is not going to be great.
Fair enough. That makes all sense. Yeah. So you kind of alluded to it a little bit, like what the purpose of a library is, because I feel like I can come up with like 8 different things a library does. So you said it was a place to store information.
In theory, to me, and not that I created this paradigm at all, if you ask to just boil down a library's main number one basic function, it's to store information, but it has to be accessible. That's a critical part of a library's function.
Okay.
Libraries do not exist to store things for perpetuity, like, let's say, an archive, a repository, or a government document building would. Some things are kept for the sake of keeping them. A library, inherently in the whole idea, is that what's there is to be shared, to be borrowed, and to be loaned, theoretically, to everyone who wants access to it. A library should be open to everyone. There really shouldn't be restrictions. But inherent in what a library does and why it exists is that this information is open, shareable, and borrowable. And that's part of why libraries were created at all, because it was hard for people. And libraries are a very old idea. They predate the Common Era. They go back into the BCs by centuries. There's this notion that there is information that should be shared to anyone that needs it. So there should be a central place that you can go and retrieve it. And now it doesn't have to be physical, obviously. It could be digital, but the sense is still the same. That there is a wealth of information and there will be a place it is stored that I can go access it when I need to. That, to me, is the library's main function.
Yeah, because there's also a piece to it where it's like a place to store knowledge, not even just information. I know they sound the same, but they're not quite.
Sure.
And there's also something about like a shared preserved history aspects to a library, right?
Libraries are cultural institutions. Whether you set one up to be or not, you're taking a snapshot, especially of anything newly created, of a time and a place and a people. All of that is, if you go back far enough, there are libraries in cuneiform, etched in tablets or what have you. There are libraries in Latin and Greek, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So even if they have similar sort of layouts and similar functions, they're inherently cultural institutions that are going to tell you about a time and a place. But they're also going to tell you about what is considered valuable by a society. No library keeps all of the books.
Sure.
That's not a thing. It's basically impossible. But more so, think about how overwhelming that would be. And the internet sort of presents you with this in a similar way, but it's not exactly what I'm getting at.
Yeah, Google's kind of like
diseased form of library. That's a great way to put it. Yeah. But that's part of, I think, why searching online can sort of be overwhelming. On paper, everything is there. In practice, not everything is there, but a library that had every book ever would have the same kind of problem. So part of why libraries function the way they do is there are limits in space and language and what have you. But it's also that any library, public, private, academic, etc., is going to have some function or some community. We usually use the phrase user base.
Sure.
You have a user base in mind and what they're going to do with that. And public libraries pretty much have a mission to serve their communities. So they're going to have a much broader base. But like a library that I work at a biological research station, has a narrower base that goes much deeper into subject matters. But libraries as an entity you can go all these different levels, which is part of why they're so useful. If I want a surface treatment of the local history of where I live, I can go to the public library. If I want a deep, detailed history of of the place where I live, I can go to my local university library. And if I want to really get into the institutions that were built where I live, I can go to a local historical society or government archives or library. But the point is that based on what information I'm trying to find, there is a subset of this larger idea that says, hey, we exist to provide this information and you need it, so come and access it.
Sure. And also the shared history part is really interesting to me because the way that we started this episode was talking about how, like, people in Gettysburg were just not as smart as us because we have tanks and they don't or whatever. But so who are the people writing the books in the library? Are they not as smart as...
Who are the people writing the books?
Are they not as smart as we are?
In a public library setting, you have to be published by a publisher. So there are some sort of parameters.
Sure.
You can't self-publish a book and say, I, Joe Gentili, wrote this book and put it on a library shelf.
Sure.
And expect it to be borrowed.
Okay.
So there are some minimal...
So let me rephrase this, right? Because there are lots of sections of a library.
Sure.
Right? So we'll say the more information-based sections of the library. Are those people who wrote those books on philosophy, politics, law, all of the things that you can find in a library today, or were they just not as smart as we were?
So I mean, no. The short answer is no. This is a really complicated idea that people much smarter than me have spent a lot of time and effort on. But it's a sort of anachronistic kind of thinking pattern that we have that, like, because people didn't have the technology, the information, or the ability we have, that they were somehow stupider. And first off, intelligence is subjective, right? Did they know less? It's kind of getting at a more concrete question, but even that, like, and a great example of this is the notion that people thought the world was flat in the Western world.
Sure.
There was a person in the ancient Greek world in, I think, the 300 BCs, it might have been the 200 BCs, that calculated the earth was round based on the shadows cast by objects at different points in the day. So if you understand some minimal amount of three-dimensional geometry, they just measured the angle of, I think it was a stake versus the sun.
Sure.
And anyway, found it over time, and they were able to figure out the circumference of the earth like 97% accurately. And this was over 2,000 years ago using an abacus or whatever. So, like, but we have this notion that, and the hows and whys of this particular thing are very complicated. We're not going to get too deep into that. But we probably all heard that, like, up until Columbus or whatever, people thought the earth was flat. And that's patently false.
Right.
But it plays into the premise of your question. The notion that people were dumber in the past because they didn't know what we knew. There's lots of stereotypes like that play into that. But you can also make this sort of counter argument. A lot of what we take for granted as, like, inherently part of the life we lead today is hundreds or thousands of years old. Most of the religions that the average person practices on planet Earth are very old, very 1,000+ years for many of them. A lot of the philosophical notions we take for granted are incredibly old.
Very much. We can start with, like, so justice.
Yeah, sure.
Democracy. The number of things that are thousands of years old are astonishing. Yeah.
Justice is a great, like, you talk. Part of the whole point of this podcast is that we're getting into philosophy as well as psychology. Philosophy predates psychology, but they sort of come from the same. Anyway, people have been thinking about what justice is probably since before we could formulate that into words. Like on a written page, at least.
Yeah.
How do you interact with your fellow human beings? What does it mean to live in a way that is honorable, just, acceptable, right, ethical, et cetera, et cetera? Humans have been wrestling this way longer than we probably have been writing things down, or even like hang or what have you. But at the same time, like, we tend to think of, you know, the further back you go, the less people are going to know about these subjects we're bringing up, but really about anything. And that's, I mean, it's not really true. Now, to use your example of Wi-Fi earlier, like, sure, I could go back even 40 years and no one would know what Wi-Fi is. But wireless communication predates Wi-Fi by a lot. You could telegraph somebody wirelessly for decades. You could send radio signals wirelessly before that.
Sure.
And to get, like, stretch this analogy a little bit, people have been using smoke signals for thousands and thousands of years.
Which is really clever. By the amount of work going into stretch signals is great.
Well, it's serving a similar function. I need to pass information over a long distance, and I can't just call you and say, so, like, well, if I make this specific pattern, you know that we're in trouble. And if I make this pattern, you're like, oh, okay, everything's fine.
Yeah, it's funny, right? It's like, I'm smarter because I have the internet, but I couldn't teach a dog how to fly my message from this building through a war zone to the next building to deliver him. I couldn't figure that out. I have no idea.
And that's another, like, sort of example of exactly this. What makes someone smart? I don't mean that subjectively or rhetorically.
That's a great question.
If I have the ability to raise the whole farm worth of plants and animals and goods and support myself and the people around me, like, okay, that's a super useful skill and always has been for all of human history.
Yes.
If I can teach somebody all about that and they can replicate that, that's super important. Clearly, that person is smart, but maybe they are illiterate or like had never even seen a book. And that's another thing when we talk about intelligence and knowledge. The average person probably couldn't have afforded a book in the vast majority of planet Earth up until like 500 years ago. So, like, if you're
even now, books,
and which is part of why libraries exist at all in the first place, as well. Books are very expensive and really hard to make and really hard to keep. So let's find a way to have a place that you could just have 3 copies of it, but 100 people.
Yeah. Well, and so the reason I asked the question, right, like the people who wrote those books, are they not as smart as us? And you basically said, yeah, they are just as smart as I think. And one of the realizations I've come to in all of my years of learning is the more I learn, the less I feel like I know.
That's a very,
which is
old idea.
I got my PhD 8 months ago or whatever. I feel I don't know more now. That's not how I feel. I have more questions than I've ever had.
So that's a lot to unpack. But let's start at the end.
Sorry.
Having more questions than you ever had, you could argue is the sign of seeking knowledge at all, right? Like, part of being a curious person is exactly that. Like, well, I had the answer to this question, but now I have 2 or 3 or 5 or 6 more questions. That kind of curiosity and seeking out knowledge has probably existed as long as human beings have been human beings. Like, it's part of what defines us, I would argue. So if that's a sign of, like, intelligence or smart or whatever, then are we any smarter than the people that tried it 5,000 years ago? I don't know.
Yeah, and so that's the next part of the line of thinking that I've had, right? So, like, one of the things about, and this is a little more psychological, I apologize, but one of the things about being a human is we have this weird knack for thinking that this thought I have is original. And it's my experience and interpretation that I'm not sure any of our thoughts are truly original.
I had a philosophy 300 level class once where a professor basically asked us that question. And, like, part of a philosophy class in college is to make you just, stop in your tracks and be like, what? What? Have I been thinking about this all wrong?
Who was thinking that?
Yeah, I remember, like, I wrestled with that for much longer than you probably should.
Yeah.
Do any of us ever have an original thought? I'm sure there are people that have spent their whole philosophical careers trying to answer. Sure. There have been billions, tens of billions of human beings who've had thousands of trillions of thoughts.
Right.
I like to think, and this is, I don't know how you can prove this one way or another, it's kind of got to be impossible that every thought's already been had. But it's probably hard for you to actually have an original thought, and you'd never know. There'd be no way to prove, like, wow, I'm the first and only person that ever thought this thing.
Because when you're in academia, like that's one of the things you're trying to do. You're trying to promote some level of a new idea, and you quickly learn that the newness portion of your ideas, it's going to be like 3% new, right? It's going to be like a new flavor that you put on it as opposed to a brand new idea. And I think that's kind of how it's always been, right? Like and correct me if I'm wrong, but it's my understanding that even Edison's light bulb had like 6 generations of light bulbs from people previous trying to figure that same problem out. And he used all of their work to get him to where he was, right? And I think that's what philosophy is. And even faith.
It's definitely part of, you could call it philosophy, you can call it psychology. When we all think collectively about why we exist, or all these big questions, that you cannot have an original thought wholly, and I would easily argue. Yeah. Because all of how we think about these things are grounded in where and how we were raised by whom. And I can give you a perfect example in what you would call the Western, European, whatever world. Sure. The concept of a soul is something we've all heard about, whether you believe it or not. That goes back to the ancient Greeks. If you want to get into a philosophical conversation in the last 2,500 years that involves death or what happens after death, it's almost impossible in sort of what we would call the Western world to like not have that come up. It's a universal concept. So if I wanted to contemplate the notion of what happens after I die, as somebody born to this whole tradition, could you really ever separate away from that idea? Probably not, right? And that's just one example. But when we have these conversations, when we have these thoughts, at least in part, they're grounded in our socio-cultural, economic past and where you grew up in that. But then there are also things that are probably universally human, no matter what. Like, why do I exist? People have been thinking about that since before we had words, before we had agriculture or pottery. Even and you can see that in cave paintings and stuff. You know, people painted our caves 15,000 years ago. Right. That's abstract thought, right?
Yeah.
So on some level, they're wrestling with these same kind of questions that we do. Now to try to go at you, like, would any of us say that this sort of proto-human being in a cave was as smart as we were? I think universally we would all say, no, that's ridiculous. They didn't have language. They didn't have pottery. They didn't have writing. They didn't have architecture. But this person was able to contemplate life and death. They were able to create art. They buried. Yeah. And people have been buried for a long, long, long time. This is part of what I was saying earlier. Like, what makes somebody smart? What makes somebody human is not as separable from those two ideas as maybe you could on the surface. But anyway, we probably would all agree that somebody that deep in the past was less smart than we are.
But that's funny to me, though, right? Because, like, at the same time, that person survived in a way that I certainly could not.
Absolutely.
So
killed their own food, lit their own fires, made their own clothes.
So maybe another question isn't even just are they less or more intelligent, but like, what purpose does their intelligence serve?
And some of this is about language, but I'm talking about intelligence, talking about knowledge. I think that's an important distinction here. Were people smarter or dumber in the past? I don't think it's answerable, though, as I told you, I believe that they were not dumber. Sure. But what knowledge mattered, how you disseminated that knowledge, and what was considered valuable, yes, absolutely sort of based on your time and your place and your society. That changes and fluctuates.
Gotcha. So in terms of all of this then, so you mentioned archives being different than libraries. So like a library is a place that stores smaller amounts of what we'll call knowledge, information, and history, whereas an archive is more of like a collection.
An archive is going to be much more detailed about a specific subject for a small series of subjects. A library, even a small niche library, is going to cover a vast majority of places. Authors, time periods, subject matters, etc. Even Archbold's library, where I work at, we have 9,000 books, give or take. Sounds like a small amount, but for what we do, it's actually pretty big. Those 9,000 books cover dozens of subject matters. Sure, possibly 100 plus. An archive, and again, it's not, but we're going to cover a much, much narrower point than that. Even a larger archive is going to be much more specific than that. Some archives are created by a single individual or about a single individual or event Or so like a good example would be like a Civil War diary or something like that.
Sure.
You could turn someone's materials from any major event into an archive, especially if they have written records and what have you. But that's a very personal, detailed kind of thing. Maybe you have this person's writings, maybe you have some of their clothing, maybe you have whatever. These kind of things are going to tell a much more individual, it's not exactly the word I'm looking for, but a much smaller scale kind of knowledge base than what you would find in the library. Also, archives tend to, but don't have to, involve objects in a way that libraries don't. They're not just going to be documents of photographs and videos. They're going to be stuff.
Like jackets, shoes.
Stuff people collected. We all collect stuff, whether we realize it or not. We all have our proclivities of things we like. And when you have an archive of someone, you're almost invariably going to have the things, the knickknacks, the accoutrement that they like to accumulate throughout their lives.
Sure.
And it's useful. It tells you a lot about somebody if they liked a certain kind of tchotchke or whatever. Like,
Sure. Yeah.
but in general, and I think I'm trying to, like, this is a much bigger idea that would take a lot longer to really get into. An archive, is going to be on a much smaller scale and a much more focused subject matter, but also you're going to have much more detailed records. Okay. Some archives will get down to the day, to the minute, to the hour, depending on what is saved, especially if you have minutes of stuff. And that's something we have at Archivist. We have historic board minutes from meetings that happened in the past. So it'll literally be like almost verbatim what people said in a very specific time and place on day X at time Y for an hour.
Gotcha. Yeah.
And sometimes you will have thousands or hundreds of thousands of pages of this kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. And so it's a much more deep dive into a subject matter than you're going to find in a library. But there's a lot of overlap there. And part of why my job is kind of interesting, but I'm not the only one who has this paradigm, is because I get to be working in the libraries and the archives. There's more overlap between those two entities than maybe at the surface, but they're not the same.
Sure. So based on my earlier question in this past one, is almost the purpose of a library to like organize as much knowledge and information so that the new generation can come forward and add that 3%?
I think, yes, that is a great, like if you asked me to give you a couple bullet points about why libraries exist, yes. It has to be disseminatable. But it also can't be static. If the corpus of knowledge we had was the same always, it would become progressively less useful.
Sure.
And a great example of this in the history world, when you tell the story of a historical event, that's not static. When people write about ancient Rome or the Assyrians or ancient China or whatever now, new scholarship, new archaeology, new whatever.
Sure.
So if I just tried to give you everything written about a place or an event or whatever, but then 20 years later gave you the same information, every 20 years that would become less and less useful. That doesn't mean there's no use to it, but there's always going to be new scholarship on any number of topics. Sure. And I'm talking about history because but it goes well beyond history. Think about something like physics. If a library only had 50-year-old physics books, you'd be like, wow, this physics section is useless.
So because there's like 3 generations of physicists whose information and knowledge you no longer have access to.
And so I don't know if this is exactly answering your question, but yes, there needs to be addendums, additions, but also subtractions. And this is something we have.
Oh, sure.
Some things are wrong. And if something's provably wrong in the future, you don't leave that information out there. You try that. And when I say leave it out there, in libraries, we do something called weed. I don't want to get too deep into that. But some materials are removed from the collection in every library you've ever been in. They don't have a static set of whatever that never changes.
Sure.
Usually weeding happens for physical reasons. A book's falling apart. But let's say somebody wrote a whole book and it's proven, and I mean proven to be false. You're absolutely going to get rid of that book. There's no reason to continue disseminating.
Okay. Unlike my Wikipedia pages. Okay, cool. Gotcha. So, yeah, I mean, because it really does seem to me that this idea that we're so much smarter is it's strange because from my basic understanding, it seems like we're standing on the backs of giants and using their knowledge to push us forward. And I feel like the generation after us will probably be doing something similar.
Again, not an original idea to me, and I won't take credit for this at all. But we have notion, especially living in an era that is seen as like advanced, whatever that means, that human progression is somewhat linear, that we're better off than our parents were, that they're better off than their parents were, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And these two ideas sort of overlap. If we have linear progress and things are better now than they've ever been before, then things have to have been worse. And well, why are they worse? Well, maybe it's because people were stupider. And again, like I'm not trying to be redundant here, but that's a common sort of logical conclusion from this. Like, well, if we're more progress, not progressive, but if we have progressed more, then clearly they were less progress. So ergo, you could easily say they were stupider. Part of what makes progress is intelligence, right?
Right.
I think that kind of thinking is problematic, but it's also really easy to engage in. If we're the most advanced we've ever been as a species, which you could probably make the case we are, then we were less advanced in the past. And if we were less advanced, well, then maybe we were dumb. That's not an incredible logical leap, but it's a problematic one and a wrong.
It's interesting to me because it almost seems like what we're really getting at is like our ability to survive has increased. So we're not like dying as well, seemingly silly means as we once did. And we're surviving now longer than we ever have.
I mean, medical science is a great example of that we really touched on. Like, were people stupider when they didn't realize germs were a thing? You could easily make the case, yes.
Right.
But when you really learn germ theory, some of it's counterintuitive, and all of it is based on hundreds of years of incremental advances in medical science that the further back you go, these people didn't have access to.
Yep.
And like a really simple one is washing your hands. If you want to do some research, listeners, look at how late it was figured out that you should wash your hands before you did surgery on somebody.
And it's pushback. And the
pushback that happens when the person figured it out. And I can't remember his name, otherwise I would tell you now. But it's like such a basic thing. We all know this. And not just surgery, but in general. Like, my hands have germs. I must wash them.
Yeah.
Sounds so simple. If someone didn't believe that, because the basis for that theory didn't exist, are they stupider than we are? Is kind of getting at what your question is.
Yeah.
And I mean, I would argue no. They didn't have access to the same. And this is part of why I brought up like anachronistic thinking before this. We have, like, it's hard to know exactly what people knew when you want to pick out a specific time period or place. Because these things happen slowly. When you're told about them, it makes it seem like there are these giant, great leaps forward is a phrase you hear a lot. Yeah. Most human learning does not work like that at all. It's very slow and incremental.
Yeah.
And so, like, if you went to somebody 1,000 years ago and explained germ theory to them, they would think, what? But if 500 years ago, you'd kind of be getting there. And 100 years ago, they'd be like, oh, yeah. And so, but again, does that mean the person 1,000 years ago was stupider? I don't think so. I don't think so either. I don't know. It's complicated. We feel like we're so smart. And one of the more interesting things that's happening, a phenomenon of now, is we have a bunch of states that are starting to put pencils and paper back in front of kids, and we're moving technology. And the general rationale for that, and I don't know if this is true, but word on the streets, that the generation that's going through school now is actually scoring worse on IQ scores than the generation before them for the first time since we've been measuring IQs. Which is a crazy phenomenon. I always try to acknowledge my bias. As somebody that was a history major, liberal arts major, I wrote a lot in school. We didn't take tests. Like, I didn't answer multiple choice stuff. I think that is like, it's not bad or good, but it's a natural, like, if you're going to talk about a subject, a person, an event or whatever, you have to be able to describe it coherently and in your own words. And this sort of ties into one of the first things you talked about, like, what is knowledge? Do I know something? If I know something, I should be able to explain it coherently to somebody else in a reasonably brief period of time.
Yeah.
To your specific point about pencil and paper tests, that's what they're trying to replicate. If I put a prompt through AI, it's not really going to give what I know or what I think about a subject. But if I give you a marble notebook and a pencil, and you're going to give me what you got, whether it's good, bad, or otherwise.
Right.
And I think that's a big part of why this is coming back is because it's the notion that, like, what you were getting at, what do you actually know versus what do you need confirmation of to double check, to go search. And when you get handed like a physical media like that and are asked a question, you really are being tested on what you know right now in this minute, not what you can learn or what you sort of understand. But that was my paradigm when I was an undergrad. That's how I did. And I think it was useful because if I couldn't explain this stuff coherently and briefly to some degree, did I really know it?
Sure. If you can believe it or not, briefly was not my strong point.
Well, that's good.
My professor would be like, give me 2 pages, I'd give them 15. And they'd go, okay, I can't read this. So just give me the what. No, but so it, for me, the thing about learning and perhaps knowledge then therefore is the ability to learn how to think. And so the biggest issue I see with information at our fingertips is the value of learning how to think is just decreasing. So I remember when I was a kid, and I'm sure this is like everyone my age thought the same thing, or younger, older as well. But like, why do I need to take a math test when I can just pull out a calculator? And it's like, it's that's not the point. Right? Like the point is, can you learn how to learn? Because you're going to need to do a tremendous amount of it as an adult. And so for me, that seems to be like what the purpose of the library kind of is the place to learn how to think about things in a new way, and in a way that's hopefully exciting.
So we're talking about smarter knowledge, etc. So what you were just saying, I like to think if you go in a library, you leave more knowledgeable than you entered, but you don't leave smarter. And that's not a semantic.
No.
I have not gained any intelligence because of what I did at a library, but I definitely acquired knowledge.
Yeah.
And I think that's a good way to get at sort of the heart of what you're getting. And to some degree, intelligence is subjective, but you could argue knowledge is not. You either know something or you don't.
Yeah.
But how do I rate how smart or dumb I or you or anyone else is? That's a much harder.
Yeah.
And like an IQ test or whatever is one of the most subjective ways to do this.
Sure.
And we could all probably like wrestle, but either way, like you could, I think, say you can acquire knowledge in a definable, provable way. But I don't think I could tell you that I got smarter or dumber in any kind of objective fashion.
Sure. Yeah, and I think what I'm really getting at here is kind of the premise or the name, if you will, of the episode. I feel like our knowledge base is increasing drastically, and I don't think there's any way to discount that that's a factual statement. But I don't think we're understanding it in the same way we used to.
You can sort of frame it this way, and maybe not the exact, but we can get on the surface of so many more topics than people ever could before.
Absolutely.
But can you really get deep in most of these things in a way that people couldn't? I don't really know that you can. Sure, I've come from my computer or from my phone, really deep dive on something, but I could have done that in a physical archive or a library for hundreds and hundreds of years. But I could not acquire surface knowledge of things like any one of us can with our smartphone for the vast majority of human history. The notion that I could have a real question and pick my phone up and answer it, that would have blown people's minds. Like, and not just because of the technology involved. The point is the immediacy of that. The acquiring of an answer used to be a labor-intensive and time-consuming process. And now it could just be like 5 seconds.
Yeah, and it wasn't just labor-intensive either, though. It was exciting. Oh, sure. Like, you would sit with the question. Like, you'd ask friends, parents, anyone who you could. Like, well, do you know the answer to this? And if they didn't know, you didn't know, but you stayed curious. Sure. Right, so I don't know. It's a curious dichotomy. I don't know if we're getting smarter or dumber either, but it does seem like you're right. Like there's so much surface level information that we're not doing the deep dives into anything specific, and it's almost seeming like not as important too, because like you can at any time.
So to put like a value on knowledge, in essence, is where you're getting.
Yeah.
I agree with what you just said. In a single nugget of information, it's less valuable than it used to be because it's more accessible. That's kind of paradoxical, but it's definitely true. It used to be hard to answer relatively simple questions. Now it is not.
Sure.
So you could easily make the case that any one single piece of information has like less value than it did. But does that mean I'm smarter because I can access a million different things that somebody in the past couldn't? That seems specious to me.
I agree. I agree.
But I'm sure there are people that are doing studies right now that show that the access to information we have actually does make us smarter. And you cannot argue that the access to the thinking, for lack of a better term, the people done in the past will help. If I wanted to learn about any number of ideas, the internet is, here is this idea that to me was just a word, and now all of a sudden it's wide open.
Yeah.
That was a totally infeasible paradigm for the vast majority of human history. And now you can live pretty much anywhere that has internet access, and starting with a word or a sentence, build this huge like volume of understanding.
Right.
But again, I mean, this is what we've been getting at this whole time. I don't think that makes me smarter than somebody that wrestled with these questions that couldn't answer them because the information wasn't there.
Right.
If anything, you could make the case, because intelligence is somewhat subjective, that they made themselves smarter through the thinking about it in a way that I couldn't because the information was just there.
Under
I don't
harder
necessarily,
circumstances too.
I don't necessarily agree with what I just said, just to further muddy the water. But you could easily make that.
Yeah, you can make that.
That the thinking about it somehow made me a more intelligent and more well-rounded person.
Yeah.
And ultimately, part of why Jimmy and I talk about this kind of stuff and why this podcast exists is because we think about thinking, right? I've used that phrase before. And that's sort of what all of this is about. Like, are you smarter because you think more? I think it's something we've been getting at as sort of this whole time without actually spelling it out. If you have to try harder, does that make you smart?
I would say that the more energy and time you put into something, the more care you take after it. And I think that probably adds up value to what you're doing. So but smarter? No, I don't think so. I don't think so. No.
I agree. And like that's sort of what we've been getting at this whole time. And to like go all the way back. If I went back 100 years or 500 years or 1,000 years or 2,000 years or 5,000 years, you can't say that like, well, 5,000 years ago people were this smart and now we're this smart, and there's this straight line of like. But I think that would make sense if you could say that. And of course, people were stupider back then. They believed XYZ that was crazy, and they didn't know about XYZ that is obviously right. But I don't really think that those sort of thought exercises and those sort of ways to look at the world are actually measuring intelligence.
No.
And I don't think that we're any smarter than we were back then. But the average person has way more information than the average person would have at any point in the history of the human race. Yeah. That's indisputable. But that doesn't make you smarter. And that's some of this is getting into like, what is knowledge? What is intelligence? What is what have you? Even if you had access to literally every piece of information ever, you'd never be able to digest it. We're all limited to like what we can do. So that's what could the smartest person from antiquity do with the internet is an interesting question.
That would be a very interesting question.
Because the dumbest person now with the internet can do much more than the smartest person. I mean, could. And when I say do, I mean in terms of accessing these things. But like, what could Socrates do with the World Wide Web? Like, that's
actually almost scary to think about.
Yeah, that's
no, but yeah. So I think that you almost kind of just got to my point. Knowledge becomes so vast across the horizon, our understanding of it has to dwindle because we just can't hold on to that much information. Which I'm guessing is why we're going back to pen and paper.
There's sort of, and this is like probably sad, but it's we're limited and capped to some degree as well. It's not like we have an unlimited capacity for knowledge.
I can't just keep jamming.
I can't just keep jamming stuff there and then remember it forever again. Like eventually other things are going to go. Like, and so when you, I don't want to say are overloaded, but when there's so much potential information, you could easily make the case that we know a lot more than these people in the past about a lot more.
Sure.
But we know much less about the things we know a lot about. If you were an expert in your field now, and you were an expert in your field, and I'm not saying any particular field, so like, does the access to more information today make you more of an expert? I don't know that it would. If anything, maybe it doesn't. But that's some of this has to do with lots of things we've been talking about earlier about where information comes from, how it's curated. For sure. Because in theory, if you were an expert in something, you learned from another expert. Whereas with something like the internet, you could learn from, frankly, an imbecile that doesn't know what the hell they're talking about. Like that's possible.
Yeah. All right. So with all of this, I really enjoyed this conversation. I have one last question for you. What is one thing that you know?
All right. So it's going to sound like a cop-out, but I'm firmly of the school that I don't think you could know anything conclusive. Now, I know that's like a controversial take, potentially.
Let's say you had to throw your money on one thing that you
I mean, you
like
could
all the
like,
chips.
Classically, like Cody, Joe, ergo sum, right? Like I think, therefore, I am. That's a pretty good one. I'll tell you this, Saul, and then maybe this is, but U.S.
Okay.
I know that truth and falsehoods exists because of logic, because of all the like different things that have led to where we are with our knowledge of philosophy and what have you. But I don't know what is true and what is false. How about that? Like I know that certain things are correct. And I know that certain things are incorrect. But I think like figuring out exactly what those are is part of what we're all trying to go through.
That's probably kind of the part of this. And so at the end of all of this, like it really does. And the point I'm trying to get at isn't that we're stupid or they were stupid, but it's more like I feel like we're missing the reverence towards the people who came before us and thought out all of these ideas that we still carry forward. And I think that it's important for us to remember that we're on the backs of giants and our thoughts are carrying forward with them.
Everything, not everything, but almost everything we think of as these sort of institutional, big picture kind of things have been created over hundreds and hundreds of thousands of years by millions of different people having these different little contributions.
Yep.
It's something that like you could conflate intelligence with that, right?
Yes.
It's like
Yes.
experience versus empirical knowledge. In essence, is kind of what this is about. But like the fact that we can have a conversation like this at all is because people have been formulating ideas that will help us verbalize these things, but also understand these things for thousands and thousands of years.
For sure.
And ultimately, conversations like this one have been happening probably as long as human beings were able to communicate.
God, I hope so.
Which I think is one of the real fascinating things about the continuum of all this at all. If we are getting smarter, dumber, or otherwise, we're still asking probably roughly the same questions that people have been asking forever.
Yeah, and perhaps that might be the most interesting way I can think of that to end this. It's like, I'm not even sure our questions have changed, which is a fascinating way to end this. Yeah.
Why do they exist? What is the purpose of reality? What is real and what is not? What happens after you die? Those are just 4 quick ones, but people have been writing, thinking, etc. about those for as long as we have been what you want to call human beings. People have been thinking about death since way before the year. We've been hearing people for 18,000, 20,000 years, something like that. And none of these other writing's only 5,500 years old.
Yep.
We've been burying people like 3 times as long as that. Some of these universal things Whether our ideas have changed, the questions have not at all.
No.
Why do I exist is something that every teenager ever asks themselves, and many adults do, as long as human beings have been around. Like, that's
Well, so Joe, historian, archivist, and librarian, all around some good dude. Thanks for coming on, man. It's been
thank you very much for having me. This was a lot of fun.
Yeah, and just remember, guys, take it one thought at a time. Thank you so much.